Well, since I do a daily little radio show, 13 minutes for a Spanish radio station in Peru, um, and I say a lot of things there that I may feel a little freer to say in Spanish and in English for that kind of audience far away, but still, nevertheless, I think I've spoken my truth and with sincerity in these programs that I do in English. I proposed to myself to do a program on the saints and spirituality, and I sort of got around to that. I think number 9 last time was on realizing my dream, how I went to Rome, etc., trying to tie that into spirituality. But for this final session, as far as this so-called introduction to Christianity is concerned, I'm going to speak about the saints and spirituality, maybe my own spirituality to some extent, and thus finish this series of introductory videos to Christianity according to me and really as a Catholic primarily, although I think there's a lot in common with non-Catholics. But I did want to speak about the saints and a little bit about my experience with them, my favorite saints, and try to wrap it up. And then probably, hopefully, we'll continue to speak about the saints because the list you're going to see is lengthy. Maybe as an ongoing thing, when I want to say do a little program in English, I'll do it on the saints. This cross is an old cross from Mexico that was in the Dominican novitiate, where I spent a good year in 1973-74 in the chapel there. I took this photo years later when I went back to the same place. And then this is a photo of a postcard that I have of a Christ showing his wounds that was dear to Saint Teresa of Avila, or Jesus, that I'm going to speak about a little bit. I was going to start saying that I kind of wanted to do this program and speak about the saints because I am in anguish right now over an argument with a dear friend. These misunderstandings happen. These times are even more difficult. And so I sort of grab on to the saints, and I hope maybe some of you will too, as I am in true pain of various sorts that I don't want to get into too much right now. This image is dear to me. This is supposed to be the oldest image or painting of the Lourdes apparitions. We just celebrated Our Lady of Lourdes February 11, and I gave 2 little programs in Spanish on the Virgin and Bernadette. And this is in the Church of Santa Maria in Aquiro, which is an old church, probably redone many times, near the Pantheon in Rome. And in 2011, I had my sabbatical semester, 4 months, February, March, April, May, the whole months of those 4. And I would, this church was very close to where I was staying at La Casa del Clero around the corner from Piazza Navona, so location. And I discovered this, and I would spend a good amount of time in prayer before this image, very modern looking. And oftentimes it would be before the rosary was prayed. then the mass would start. I think there was at least one. I think they all were Somaski fathers, or I think maybe Barnabites is another name for them. In any case, it was a nice church and very central. So sometimes you had, Roman nobility show up, and you can tell pretty quick, not just rich but noble. And I did have a chance to see at least one such family together, and there was a lot of them. And there's something different about nobles. But this is my list of my favorite saints. So I'm going to try to tie in spirituality as I also discuss these saints to some degree or another. The first thing I want to say is that I had my first big conversion at the age of 19. I'm giving my age away, in 1972. And almost intuitively or very quickly, it's one of those things. I knew who my first list of favorite saints were, so to speak. Couldn't have been that immediately because I already was interested in the Dominicans, and the first saint on this list is Saint Dominic. So perhaps it wasn't quite the same month of my conversion, which probably was June or July. I haven't really been able to remember. But by August, I was well into these things, sort of again, because I had been raised a Catholic and all that. And I came up with 10 saints that were very special to me. At least one of them, I didn't know much about really, but still that intuition of spiritual friendship. It's very interesting. So Dominic, Domingo de Guzman is there, number one, chronologically in highlighted in yellow. And then Francis. Of course, he's not, hard to know about. Then Thomas Aquinas. So obviously, I think by this time I probably was already incipiently, at least, thinking of the Dominicans. Then Catherine of Siena, Ignatius Loyola, a neighbor, friend of my mother's, and my friend, an older lady, my mother's age, I guess. She lent me Papasoli's book on Ignatius of Loyola in English, and it impressed me tremendously. I didn't want to be a Jesuit, but his life really impressed me, and I'm going to talk about that sooner or later. And then Teresa of Jesus, Avila, John of the Cross. Now, okay, by September, so that maybe that can help date this. September of 72, I was already enrolled at University of Miami studying Spanish and already thinking about going to Mexico for sure, planning on it. So I was taking Spanish courses, advanced Spanish courses, I guess. And one of my professors recommended to read a John of the Cross, especially The Dark Night of the Soul. And I read it, and I was, completely enraptured by it. I think from the age of 9 or 10, Martin de Porres had struck me very powerfully. I was in catechism. My parents would send us to catechism when we were in public primary school, and they passed around a comic book with this black saint, and I was very, very taken by it. And he became, and then my mother's too, my favorite saint, later along with Thérèse of Lisieux, the little flower. Then John Bosco by default almost, because my mother was very devoted to John Bosco. and that actually gave me a little medal for my baptism. I think it was the 28th of May. And so my middle name is John in Spanish. So I had to include him. And then last but not least, Therese of the child Jesus, who my father was very devoted to. He from a long time, and he visited Celine in in Lisieux in the late 40s, and so and he named my sister after me, uh, Teresita, which is what she's known as in Spanish. And here's a picture of the little image, or big, it's a paper size image that my father must have bought in Lisieux. It's a very unusual, like, version of the little flower. He had it always in his little office at home. He died in 76. I picked up a lot of souvenirs from my parents, but this was not something that I picked or saw or whatever. And 30 years later, in 2006, my brother's ex-wife found this in the garage, minus the frame, little rip in the bottom, but nothing. And my brother gave it to me along with a medal of Saint Therese that I have in 14 karat gold or 10. And I immediately went to Target and bought a perfect frame for it, not a fancy one, black, nice, solid, very good quality with a little mat inside, and it just perfectly covered the little rip and just perfectly showcased this image. And to me, this sort of sums it up when I see it. God's providence, surprises that can happen 30 years later. I discovered who my mother was 30 years later, after her death in 2004, she having died in 1974 when I was in Mexico, which was devastating. A lot of my, derailing in some ways took place because of that. This is my mother and me. It says Domus Mariae quadruplex. I live in a quadruplex. So it's not a duplex, it's 4 units together of 4 different, people, completely separate, but together as a duplex would be. And quadruplex means fourfold. So I named this condo that I have, 2-bedroom condo, Mary's house, Domus Mariae, 4 times over, because it's dedicated to the Virgin Mary. It's dedicated to my mother, whose name was Maria. I closed the purchase without planning it on the anniversary of my mother's death, July 15. And I moved in August 22, Mary, Queen of the Universe. So a lot of my spirituality, if you will, is looking for signs of God. This is my mother's passport picture for the only trip she took. This is my mother, young and quite beautiful. This is my mother in a typical sort of funny expression of hers. This is my mother in perfect form. She was a very fun person that was the light of her friends in Key Biscayne. And then this is with my father at maybe a first communion or some other, or a party or something. And I'm looking for the last picture ever taken of her before she died. This is a very nice photo of my mother as a Dutch girl, probably as a teenager. And then I don't know if I could find the last photo that my father sent me. Here it is, of my mother at a baptism with a glass of champagne or something before she died at the age of 47 or 48, depending on when she was born, which is a subject of some uncertainty. I think we celebrated September 24, but her driver's license says March 9, which is interesting for me because that's the feast of Francis of Rome, which is going to be among my favorite saints. So in any case, this is the original list of 10. And then it sort of began growing. And I want to talk a little bit about why these saints, etc. But it began to grow. Of course, I was always very devoted to Paul, but it grew. I think the first addition that had to be put in was Bernadette Subiru, because I have a very special devotion to her. And I've read, I said it in Spanish the other day, an enormous amount about her. So she had to be number 11, and 11 is not a good number. You need 12, basically. So I think the following one was Elizabeth of the Trinity. And I have stories about her. I have stories about all these people. And then sometime later, already with the Dominicans, well, I discovered Elizabeth of the Trinity with the Dominicans in the first weeks of the novitiate in 1973 in Agua Viva, Mexico, state of Mexico. But I also discovered Edith Stein. So she had to be included, And then, by accretion, I guess, more became added. And I finally came up, I guess, with, if you look at this list, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 groups of 3. So that's 27. At one time it was 25. And I think I added Francis of Rome and Paolo di Francesco di Paula, Francis of Paula, and I'll tell you, why eventually. But Saint Joseph had to be there. I mean, obviously Mary receives what is known in Catholicism or in theology as hyperdulia, which is some sort of super reverence. The saints receive simple dulia, reverence. Latria, worship only God. So these are people that I venerate, and Mary is not here because she is super venerated. So Joseph. Then Miriam would be Mary Magdalene. I tried to put the original names of these saints in their own language, Hebrew. Paulus in Latin, St. Paul. Hieronymus, Jerome, patron of Bible scholars, which I consider myself to be. I taught Bible, etc. Augustine, I already went through. But then after Francis comes Clare. And I'm very devoted to her, even though she's always been a somewhat murky figure to me. Not that I haven't read anything about her. I have read some things about her. But nevertheless, it's the image, really, of this pure soul, austere. She was not this pretty girl from the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon, like that, necessarily. She was young, she might have been. Saint Rita of Cascia. I was baptized in the Church of Saint Rita, and I went to Kasha in my sabbatical semester to visit her place, her, her casket, the rose she made, bloom, etc. Interesting story about her, not much is really known, but we can count on the fact that most of these saints suffered. And Rita, of course, was famous for this spine that sort of detached itself from the crown of thorns on the crucifix and embedded itself in her forehead. And they even say it stunk. And they made a trip to Rome one time, and I think for that trip it ceased to stink. But normally that was one of the burdens of Rita and of people around her. Francesca Romana, one of those things. I was with a couple friend of mine from Miami visiting Rome in 2004. And I'm giving a little tour. Those were my heydays when I would go to Rome, like I said, twice a year, usually for Easter and Christmas or something, or Holy Week and Christmas. And, seminary had great vacation times. And I'm with my friends. I'm showing them around the Colosseum. We venture into what I really wasn't even sure what it was at the time, the Basilica of St. Francis of Rome. And all of a sudden, for whatever reason, I find myself in a place where she had been buried. In fact, I think she's still buried there, although I forget whether she was moved over to Tor de Specchi, which is some other area of Rome, not far away, but different. And I've been there too. It's only open once a year or so. But all of a sudden, I find myself with my friends before this Francesca Romana. And I just intuited that she was a saint dear to Rome, to Romans. I think last time I told you the story of the Madonna dell'Estrada, that when I went to Jesuit church, filled on a Saturday, I think, like I said, May 24th, all the taxi drivers and street cleaners were there. I had intuited a little bit about that image that I had seen in photocopy, but Francesca Romana, I really didn't know much about her. Now I've read several books about her. I've been to her beautiful uh, convent that she founded, and I am, very happy to have her as one of my friends. I think she's also involved with car driving protection. So I've had a couple of uh, assistance incidents, I think, regarding her. Francesco di Paola. Now, Francesco di Paola is a saint that I stumbled upon when my first year in Rome studying, was with a Dominican. I may have told you this story before. I was with a Dominican talking around Piazza di Spagna, and he took his leave, and I then turned and I saw this church called Sant'Andrea delle Fratte, and I wandered in. First Sunday of Advent, 1996. Hear this celestial music, and I start looking around, and I see, before I saw this is the beautiful altar of Francis of Paul. But before I even did that, I saw the inscriptions regarding the conversion of Alphonse Ratisbonne, which is a very interesting story of a man from the famous Jewish banking family, the Rothschilds. He was Ratisbonne. And there's a whole story, but he was given the miraculous medal, which I wear, as some sort of a dare for a month. And he walked into this church. This is not the chapel he walked into, but he walked, I'm going to try to find that now. He walked into this church, and the Virgin appeared to him. And so once the Virgin had appeared to him, he immediately asked for baptism. So this is indeed the altar that they've built for in commemoration of this famous apparition in 1842, if I remember correctly. I think January 20th or 22 or 4 or something. I think 1842. And so this is the main, or at least the main chapel, the main altar is for St. Andrew, Sant'Andrea delle Frate. Frate must be some sort of a tree producing fruits, etc. But when I saw this painting, it's a simple painting, but covered in gold. This is Bernini stuff. These are the finest sculptors in Italy, etc. This is the Minimi Church, the Minims. So Francis of Paul from Calabria, very loved in Calabria, south of Italy. His parents, he was very sickly. I think he was going to die. His parents named him Francis in honor of Francis of Assisi, 400 years before or so. Let's look at the dates for Francis of Paul. It's actually 200 some years before only. And so he eventually founded these Minims, and they have this church that I used to go to quite a bit, particularly because I was devoted to La Madonna del Miracolo, the Lady of the Miracle. So along with La Madonna dell'Estrada, the one I showed you last time, which is the one that, I discovered with the street cleaners and all that, La Madonna del Miracolo, the Lady of the Miracle, is a place that I used to spend a lot of time praying. When you're in these churches, of course, you are soaked with the centuries of spirituality and praying that is still in the air, and the traditions and everything. So, I mean, where you pray, I suppose, has something to do with, with how you feel when you pray. Obviously, temples and in my house, for example, my condo, I have a lot of religious images. And they help me, icons in a way, and they help me to pray. So getting back to the list here, of course, Inigo, I said, and Teresa, Jesus, I again knew, intuited she was very important and powerful. If I had to retrace, how did you learn about these people by the time you were 19? Well, I did have a chance to learn about them, something, but this is not household talk in my house or anything. My parents didn't talk about these people. My mother may have said something about St. John Bosco. I would have seen her praying her book, 9 Tuesdays of St. John Bosco. But to me, these are spiritual osmosis type things. Then Rosa of Lima, contemporary to Martin of Porres in Peru, was added to this list probably much later. I actually spent my first morning in my new place on August 23, the day after August 22, Our Lady Queen of the Universe. August 23 is Rose of Lima. And that very same year that I bought this place in 2008, I was invited to go to Peru with my friend, to stay with her brother. She also came along to meet some other people, etc., for me to meet some other people. And when I went to one of my first, desires was to go see the Church of Martin de Porres. but the guy that I had hired to drive me says on the way, it's better to go to St. Rose of Lima first, which I was very interested in going. And the day before, I had purchased a beautiful diptych, which I have to show you. I have to show you this diptych of Rose of Lima, which is right here. And of course, I became devoted to her even more. But when I went to her church, I'm walking and I see a Dominican. Of course, she was a Dominican tertiary, third order Dominican, like St. Catherine, basically. St. Martin de Porres was a lay brother Dominican. I see this Dominican coming out, older man, and I started talking with him, and somehow or other he said he had been in Mexico. I said I had been in Mexico too with the Dominicans. What is your name? He was a very famous, I forget his name now. I forget his name now, but he was a very famous. I had never really had him, but I heard about him in Mexico. And we were right next to the cell outside the church, which St. Rose built basically with her own hands and her brother's help, where she spent her very brief life of about, I guess, 30 or 33 years, if she was that old when she died. Let's look at the dates. Rosa Lima, 14, yeah, 30 years old or so. Um, it was very interesting that I would run into a venerable Dominican right at that moment in this beautiful trip to Peru, to Lima. And when I then went to the place of Martin de Porres, where he's buried and everything, I just ran into the perfect guy to show me everything very nicely. So I take all those things as spiritual gifts that God gives you. Saint Louis-Marie Grignon de Montfort is very famous and dear to many conservatives. He had he was a poor soul. He suffered. He was rejected everywhere. He clung to Mary. He wrote the Treatise of True Devotion to the Virgin Mary, which was stored and lay hidden for, I think, 100 or more years, way after he was dead. He's got The Secret of the Rosary, which I read during that conversion period in 1972. So he was added on to this list. I ended up reading quite a bit about this man. I even, and I can't find all these pictures now, but I even, during that sabbatical semester, I had the opportunity to do everything. I went to Francesca Romana on her day, March 9th, which was also Ash Wednesday. I got a chance to go to Tordespeki, her monastery, which is only open once a year. That particular year, because of the Easter season, they changed the date, but I made it to the right date. Also, because of Easter, they changed Grignon's celebration, April 28th. They changed it to some other date, maybe I think May 4th or something. And of course, I knew where it was. It was the Church of Mary, Queen of Hearts in Rome. It's her mother church. And I went to Mass very early that morning at a church that I rarely have been to. I mean, I visited there. They gave me a beautiful book when I did visit because I consecrated myself to Mary as he recommends, March 25th of 2005, which happened to be Good Friday. So I did my consecration on Good Friday, but I told them, I said, I won't be able to come here. You guys will be closed. I want to deliver you my consecration so I can get my yearly indulgence, etc. And they said, well, you can leave it here anyway, etc. So that morning I went to Mass, and like happened with when I went to visit St. John Bosco in Turin in 2011 in that sabbatical semester that I did a pilgrimage, no one got up to read. So I got up to read. And I was very inspired when I read in Italian on the Mass for in celebration of Marie Guignon de Montfort. So much so, I suppose, that when the Mass was over and the church was closing, I guess, and I was about to leave, this priest ran after me, basically, and gave me this beautiful, uh, holy picture of Grignon de Montfort. I think it's the representation of the statue in St. Peter's Basilica. And so I took that as a reaction to my devotion by one of these Montfortian priests that I have met several, including Haitians that are very strong, I think, in Haiti, the Montfortians. Now, also around, I forget what year it would have been, probably in the 80s or something, I learned about Benedict Joseph Labre, the homeless wandering saint. And I was very moved by that. I do identify quite a bit with these poor souls. I'm reading about Jack Iglesias, a different story. But Benedict Joseph didn't fit into religious orders. He couldn't make it, couldn't stay, his nerves, etc. Even though he was middle class and clean, he embarked upon these series of pilgrimages. Went to Loreto in Italy. I went to Loreto just because he had gone to Loreto. And he went, I think he went to Santiago de Compostela in the far northwest of Spain. And he went to confession one time with this priest whose book I now have in Italian, old stuff that they reprint. And the priest just burst out crying after hearing him in confession. I guess the pathos, the sadness, the suffering. Benedict slept in the 5th station of the cross in the Colosseum. And he was, with lice and in rags, very poor. And he would spend a long time in a church that was basically a few steps from where I lived for a year at the Angelicum, the Dominican convito, a residence for priests, seminarians, and even people like me, lay people studying theology full time, I guess. Santa Maria dei Monti, Our Lady of the Hills. He would spend hours and hours and hours there. One day, at the age of 35, on April 16th, which is really the same day that at the age of 35, Bernadette died a century after, more or less. He collapsed in the church. They took him out to a butcher's residence, I think on the 2nd floor, next door. And he died there. And I learned during my studies in Rome, in the 96 to 99, that they opened on April 16 the place where he died, where they have some of his relics, and they celebrate Mass. So I went over there, Via dei Serpenti, which is sort of on the way to Termini bus station, if you have any idea of places in Rome. Via Nazionale is a big street full of stores that leads all the way to the big train and bus station, Termini, Roma Termini. And I went to that place, and I was very, moved. And I returned later on my sabbatical semester where like I said, I did everything and heard mass from a priest that had been assigned to the church of Benedict Joseph Labre. And I felt so close to this saint, and I've had an occasion to read about him. And that book that I mentioned, I haven't gone around to finishing it or even getting too far with it. But it's in the old print. It's just a reprint of a 17th century or 18th century book, you know. So he's one of my favorite saints. When I was in my sabbatical semester, I went in the morning on April 16th to a special celebration of Bernadette at that church that I told you about, where I would pray before the image. But then a little bit later, I went to the other place to commemorate Benedict Joseph Labre. So those two saints for me are united by virtue of the fact they both died at age 35 on the same April 16th, about 100 or so years difference. John Bosco, because of my mother, I spoke about him. I stayed in the quarters of his foundation next to the great Basilica of Mary Help of Christians in Turin, where I said I read at Mass, 6 p.m. or so. I can tell you the date. It was the 4th of April, 2011. My next stop was Martha Robin, if you will, in the south central France. But she's not on this list. She's servant of God. Bernadette Soubirous, I have great devotion to, and I'll probably talk about her some other time more. Charles de Foucault, I discovered in a very interesting way. I had arrived in Mexico in July of 1973, and I spent 1 or 2 days in the big convent next to the university in the capital. But then they sent me to the postulancy place, people not yet novices, in the state of Mexico, west of Toluca, to this beautiful hacienda. I could tell you stories about these experiences. Can you imagine living in an ex-hacienda from the 1700s, not in perfect state of repair, but I mean, grounds and gardens and fountains, all old and all. It wasn't like a pristine, rich people's place. It was simply full of old history. And of course, we would get that for dinner. We would sit down and eat. That was just a beginner. The first day, I think they snuck some real hot chili in my scrambled eggs or something, and I almost died. But what they were reading that time at night in the postulancy, in this ex hacienda de Tultenango near El Oro, Mexico, was this spiritual biography of Charles de Foucault. So from that time, I remember him and began to love him. And I just recently reread it, probably for the third time. And I've read some other stuff. Very, very interesting conversion from being a party animal kind of guy, kicked out of the army, etc., and then went to the Sahara to give silent testimony before the Muslims, the Bedouins, etc., and was killed by a youth that didn't really know what he was doing in these wars between the French and the Arabs and all this stuff. He died in 1906, clearly a saint. But, canonizations are not like, a real competition to get into some school or something. The opportunity as perceived by the Congregation for the Causes and by the Vatican excuse me, whether the saint is from a country that doesn't have a saint, or whether the saint is a young person that will attract like young people, etc. For whatever reason, and or an organization that has a lot of money to promote the cause of their guy or gal saint, and they can get them in, maybe, like some people try to get into school, good prestigious schools, by giving a donation or something. So Charles de Foucault was, his cause was, wasn't going anywhere for a long time. And I heard rumors, well, he was so dissipated that he would be a bad example. Well, we had a conversion. I mean, or the little brothers of Jesus that he founded, or at least are inspired by him, didn't have any money to do anything, so that didn't, you know, make things progress. But finally, he was beatified. His feast is December 1, and the Pope Francis wants to canonize him, but I don't think the opportunity has yet arisen for that particular celebration. Now, Teresa of Lisieux, I said already, my father was very devoted to her. When I was at University of Miami, I finally went and got the Story of a Soul from the library. I remember the book still. And I read it, and I was, enraptured. Since that time, I will say I've read everything she ever wrote in French, including her plays, including her poetry, Story of a Soul. I even have a 1914 edition of the Story of a Soul with poems and, I think, last interviews and letters attached. I've read all her letters. I bought those in Mexico back in the 70s. And so I really, really, really identify with her, and I really want to talk about her more on some other occasion. Of course, these two, they happen to be together here. Charles de Foucault and Thérèse of Lisieux were called by Yves Congar the two lighthouses, or the two lights that signal the 20th century. Thérèse dying just before, Charles just a few years into the 20th century. And they both sort of represent the same kind of simple spirituality. That Foucault was not about preaching to anybody. He was about his example and charity, and leaving his, splendid contemplation, if you will, to attend to constant visitors, importunities, etc. And he died at the age of, 42 plus 6, 48. Is that what it is? 42 plus 6 is 48. Elizabeth of the Trinity, I discovered in the novitiate in Mexico, 1973, when I was enthralled by Thérèse of Lisieux, fellow Carmelite that Elizabeth knew about. And a co-novice said to me, this one is even more mystical, etc. At the time, she was just Sor Isabel de la Trinidad in Spanish, Sister Elizabeth of the Trinity. She got beatified a lot later and was canonized 3 or 4 years ago now. But I really, she's a very attractive figure, but I really had this, again, an intuition about her of some sort. Of course, being a Carmelite, she was a Carmelite. I later joined the Carmelites, but being a Carmelite, even when I was a Dominican, attracted me to her quite a bit. And I sort of made this plan in some way, this is 1973. I will go to Dijon one day to visit where she was, etc. And sure enough, in that sabbatical semester, 2011, 38 years later, which is a beautiful biblical number from Deuteronomy 2:14 and John chapter 5, the paralyzed guy that says they always beat me to the pool. He's been lying there 38 years. 38 years is a biblical number, so I finally got to go to Dijon. It's not really Dijon proper anymore. The convent was abandoned or sold for reasons unknown or undisclosed, and it's in Châteauneuf. No, it's in Flavignac. So I went and I spent the night there. Tell you a little story. See if I can find this, I'll be very happy. Which I won't be able to. But in any case, yes, I can, because you see, God always does things. So I stay in this convent, or in the guest rooms of the Carmelite house. I do my prayer with the nuns. The whole hour in silence, I was used to that. They were kind of pleased about it. And they immediately wanted me to write in their golden book, Livre d'Or, which is guest book that you sign in or something. And I think I've said this before, but I opened it up and I said, give me a second, let me do this or that. But I open it up and I see these very simple writings in Spanish from Latin America. And I go, how did they wind up here? This is out of the way. Maybe they went to Dijon years ago. I don't know. But I wrote from my heart, because I have read everything she wrote too. It's not as much, perhaps, all her letters basically. And it just came out of my heart very simply and sincerely. I wrote it in Spanish. No sooner had I put that book back that I get a knock on my door, sort of an anxious knock. And in French, I'd taken a whole course in French just to be able to understand and speak some French. I can read French rather well, but I took a whole course, a crash course in Rome, 5 weeks for that pilgrimage. We have a cadeau, we have a cadeau, we have a gift for you. And the gift was this strand of her hair, in this little leather canvas case with her picture, which they normally sell. I had bought, a couple of books from them, at least one big, thick one. And they were kind of concerned that I spent too much money. I don't know. But the point being that this was a beautiful gift to have, an actual strand. She wasn't canonized yet. This is 2011. She was beatified, I'm sure. And what the nuns have kept, and it was a little community, but a lot of young nuns, not just old nuns, is her arm. I don't know that I could find that. Maybe I could. No, I can't. This is the photo that I saw in Mexico. This is the image of her. And by the way, this is like, I think, the last one. She's still attractive, but a skeleton. She had Addison's disease. The same thing Kennedy had many years, at least 50 years later, or some 50 years later, which could be controlled quite well, or maybe even not cured. I don't think it's the word, but in her case, she couldn't even swallow water. She said, the first thing I'll ask in heaven is for water. She was burning inside. And the only thing she could actually do, maybe a little ice cube or some fine chocolates. She wasted away at the age of 26, 1880 to 1906. Elizabeth of the Trinity. She had been a pianist. Finally, or almost finally, because we're running out of time, Tito Brandsma was a not discalced but regular ancient observance Carmelite that I read about somewhere a long time ago, that the Nazis had done chemical experiments on him, which just tore me up. He was, I think, the founder of the great University of Nijmegen in the Netherlands that the Dominican Schillebeeks taught at. And I've read stuff by Tito Bransma, and I have a lot of devotion to him. He was a gentle soul. He smoked the pipe, gentle soul, and died at the hands of the Nazis because he wasn't Jewish, but he protested or represented something the Nazis did not like. Finally, in the novitiate, like I said, 1973, I ran into a book that I bought relatively recently, a thin, book of pictures and narrative on this Edith Stein, philosopher who became a Carmelite and then who was taken to Auschwitz, Birkenau. And I've read a good bit about her. I just finished reading a book only about Edith Stein's visit to the Boiron Benedictine Abbey that she would go for Christmas and Easter. Like I would go to Rome. Well, she said that's a corner of heaven on earth. And the abbot there, Walzer, very progressive, learned man. Now, that monastery is a center of scholarship, even for critical textual criticism of the Bible, New Testament anyway. It's a very, very interesting place. But this abbot was not liked by the Nazis. And so he had to leave his post, wound up in France, then Algeria, was in the United States, etc. And I read a book just about all the correspondence, and Pius XII visited there when he was nuncio, and all these things about the experience of Edith Stein in the Beuron, Beuron, monastery. I had to read it in French because I don't think it exists except maybe in German, and I preferred to read it in French for sure. But in any case, I was very taken by her. And I was lucky enough to go to the bittersweet, I would say, canonization of Edith Stein in 1998, I think it was, or nine, but probably 98. Say bittersweet because my friends, the Dames of Zion, the Sisters of Zion, you know, balked at a Jew becoming canonized. I don't have a problem with that. Been reading about her, and she was very proud to be Jewish and very Jewish. Like just the other Teresa had a Jewish grandfather, Teresa of Jesus, and she acted very Jewish in her love of learning. You could prove in Spain you weren't Jewish by showing you were illiterate. Teresa loved to read, loved learning, loved learned men, and was very good in financial and business, purchases for her nuns and convents and all that. Very practical and very much a city woman rather than a labrador, a peasant that works the land, etc. So coming up almost to an hour, the longest one I've probably ever done. I'm going to stop there, consider this intro to Catholic Christianity finished, and I hope to continue, God willing, um, with topics perhaps related to the saints, because I do love the saints, and I have devoted a lot of time to the saints, reading about them, etc., visiting their places too, even. And so, if I can share some stories like that, and some people like them or something, so much the better.